With that, I would like to invite Aroma Ravi to please make the presentation.
Thanks, Kavita. So, thank you so much. It's really nice to see so many of you here and lots of new faces. I'm going to, over the next maybe hour or so, take you through a little bit of an interesting journey. It's going to be in 3 parts. The first is, of course, looking a little bit retrospectively at what's happening in the programs and doing a quick recap of the kind of questions we've dealt with in the last few years. I think it might be useful because we are now entering, as we go into the general elections next year, what I hope is a new phase in how we look at urban questions. So, one of the key things that we're trying to do here is reflect using evidence. And like Kavita said, what we've tried to do over the last many years as a community, and IHS is just a small cog in that process, is really lay out the evidence of what actually exists. This is a world that's getting more and more complex, especially with certain world leaders doing all kinds of interesting things in a post-truth kind of environment. So the real focus is to try and say, if this is the evidence, then you can have multiple views of processes, and then we can at least have a debate and move forward on a range of things. So I'm going to try and do that quite quickly. So I'll start with the sort of a retrospective review. Then I'd look specifically at the question of climate, because we've just finished a very interesting piece of work, partially anchored here and partially globally, looking at the connection between climate and cities. I've spent the last 5 weeks pretty much running across all continents trying to sort of lay out what's happening on the climate front as we go into the final negotiations of the next stage of negotiations of Paris Climate Accord. And then I'll close with trying to see how we can operationalize these processes. That's broadly what I will try and deal with. Of course, what I should say very clearly is that this is the work of hundreds of people. So I'm just presenting it. So we're trying to aggregate a whole range of ideas. It cuts across a whole range and a wide range of questions. So it's not, this is an example, let's say, of some of our interdisciplinary inquiry, which comes obviously from empirical facts, but it comes problem backwards. Because the key challenge that we have today, I think whatever sector we talk about, whether it is the urban sector or dealing with other sectors of the national economy or other social questions, we really have to look at questions problem back and not look at it from either the department we come from or the institution we come from or the particular kind of discipline. So in some senses, this will stretch you, at least in many different directions. It will be both micro and macro, and I'll try and make the connections between that. So very quickly, the first thing that I'm going to do is to look back a little bit. And the reason I'm doing that is there are a lot of people who are not actually in this room. Most of our learners, because we've got standing room only at the moment, are on the, our fellows are on the 3rd floor. And I think it would be really wonderful for them to draw upon the very wide experience that people have in the room. I mean, there are at least 30, 40 people who are there trying to understand how this sector and the kind of questions we're dealing with have actually changed over time. And we have people here who have maybe 40 or 50 years experience of working on urban questions. So very quickly, I just this is, I guess, a personal reflection in some senses, looking backwards, maybe, about 30, 35 years or so, at sort of watersheds in urban development policy. At least as far as I'm concerned, there was very little engagement in the urban space till the early 80s. There was a lot of stuff that's there from the first plan onwards, etc. But I think the watershed, in terms of looking focused work in the urban space, came from the Planning Commission Task Force on Housing and Urban Development that actually set the ground for stuff. It's been 35 years just now. Of course, some of us here will still remember that process. Rakesh Mohan, who was the vice chair of IHS for a while, was the person who led this kind of process that's here. So that was the first time that in a country that's largely rural, still has a rural imagination, this emerged as a question that was quite important. And if you look at the task force report, you'll still see that we are grappling with a range of questions that is still not addressed as yet. I mean, that's sort of the core, the beginning of that engagement. So we're talking about 6 plans at that point of time. And then a lot of interesting contests that most people have forgotten. In fact, sometimes when I go into the Ministry of sort of Urban Affairs, Housing, whatever it is, it's changed its name so many times, you have to go to the Joint Secretary in charge and give them a copy of the National Commission on Urbanization report because they don't have it anymore. No, you have it. Because you're a special person, but new people who come in other places, yeah, exactly. So many of us have copied our personal copies and given it to multiple joint secretaries who are in charge of the process. But the other thing that happened in the 80s really, I mean the NCU is quite important, and it's somewhat dated just now because Charles has gone on, Xerxes Desai has gone on, the key people who ran this thing. It was the first attempt, somewhat naively set up by the Prime Minister at that point of time, to try and look at urbanization in a holistic kind of a manner. And if you look at many of the questions that we're dealing with, even then, from rural-urban linkages to cluster development and X, Y, and Z, or even infrastructure, most of those questions are still relatively unanswered in some ways. Many things have gone on, but in a sense, if you really want to understand how policy is actually working itself out, that's a good way to start, and you still get a pretty good cross-section. Of course, the analytical techniques and methods and processes were somewhat naive in today's context because we have a lot more technology on that kind of question. The other thing that's interesting, I think, at that point of time was a significant movement that came from civil society on the rights front, which in some senses got almost lost just now. There was a significant push across the country after the Olga Tellis case to actually amend the constitution and insert the right to housing into the constitution. It went actually to select committee stage, and of course then it fell apart because of a whole range of other processes led by Justice Krishnaiah, who was the doyen of a lot of work in the legal space at that point of time. The reason that I'm mentioning this is the rights agenda in some senses has gone pretty much out of the door subsequently in the urban space. In fact, the interesting thing is the South Africans picked this up and it's actually written into the constitution. And it came from people who were working in this process. Of course, we have a number of people in the legal profession, including people on the bench who've actually picked this up. So there was a very interesting period of contest at that point of time. And then, of course, about 5 years later, you see a whole range of institutionalization in some senses, what I would call the zero generation urban development programs. In the 8th plan, both the older version and the revised version that was there, many of us were involved in trying to operationalize them in different parts of the country. And of course, then the 74th constitutional amendment, just after the 73rd. And it's been 25 years since then. So in some senses, those of us who kind of worked on the periphery of that process, and in fact, K.C. Shivramakrishnan, who many of us have worked with, have sort of reflected on that, and Dr. Ravindra, of course, has been quite central in trying to operationalize it in a metropolitan context in Bangalore. Lot of potential, but unfortunately, for political and a whole range of other reasons, there's almost no implementation. And this is sort of one of the core things, especially when many of us work internationally, to look at where other countries have actually made significant progress. I mean, you cannot work in a country that's becoming increasingly urban without adequate devolution. And this was a significant step forward. But basically, we have not made progress. In fact, I would say in the Panchayati Raj regime, in many cases, certainly the politics and some of the other processes have actually worked in some states. Karnataka being one of the early starters in that place. But in the urban space, we're desperately stuck. And especially, if you look at where China was at that point of time in 1994 and where it is just now, part of their process, apart from being a very different sort of political environment, different country, different growth trajectory, is because of the way that they unshackled urban governance. And people who look at China from the outside look at it as a monolith. It isn't. It actually has a tremendous amount of innovation, a lot of democracy at local level, especially in urban areas. And part of that is because they were able to bite the bullet in that space. Then, of course, as liberalization takes place, I would say the India Infrastructure Report was a very important step in trying to look at how we could address large-scale infrastructure questions. It's a watershed in how we looked at dealing with financing, how we can structure large processes. But by that time already, if you start looking at, let's say, China's position on large scale let's say rail systems, they'd already started taking their positions at that point of time in what you see today. The single largest high-speed rail system in the world, the massive infrastructure that they're developing at that point of time, which sort of culminated in the Olympics and stuff like that. So if you're looking head on head what was happening there, we did open up and we had a lot of interesting ideas, but in terms of implementation, in terms of actually getting the policy frame organized, and of course in trying to finance stuff, we've had serious challenges over a long period of time that's there, and it shows in a whole range of things, even though growth has been moderately good. And then I would say a lot of the 90s was a lost decade for many of us in the urban space. So effectively between the early 90s when things were moving, but investments were not actually happening, some states were trying to do some things and others were not. We had a gap literally till the mid 2000s when there was a sudden realization that there's no chance in hell that you can actually maintain this growth trajectory, that you can have a services-led growth frame, or even partially very minuscule export-led growth frame, which is now translated into Make in India, without actually dealing with our urban areas. So the first big urban renewal programs emerged, but actually they were very narrow. And some of our colleagues will talk about this. If you're working in just 65 cities out of sort of 8,000, it's a very narrow spectrum. Again, because it was experimental, the government was taking a lot of big leaps in some senses to make the investment. And like everything else, because of our institutional barriers and challenges that we have, if you look at just the JNURM and the entire process, you find that maybe less than a third of the amount of resources that could have been made, at least from North Block, from the Ministry of Finance, were actually deployed. So even though the frame was interesting, there was a lot of interesting ideas of trying to move it forward, and there was analytical work that was done. The HPEC actually set out some of the questions about how much investment, etc., etc. I mean, a little bit mechanically done. So that was, to my mind, I guess what we could call the first generation programs. And then because of the political push and the recognition of how important urbanization is, even though it's a third of our population and not very central to some of the key development challenges we have, in a sense we've almost had 5 years now of these new generation programs that are there. They're building on in some senses, but you have a massive push and fillip from the highest levels of government to try and do these things and actually set targets and goals of trying to achieve a number of things which are actually quite difficult. We've had a lot of sloganeering and we've had a lot of things in the planning frame, but I think after a long time you have a very clear set of somewhat unachievable in some senses targets and the sort of opportunity to try and build them, and we're sort of halfway through that process. Those of us who've seen multiple sort of generations of policy know that when you're trying to do something new, especially in public programs and of course all the associated paraphernalia that's there, it takes time to get things going. So there have been a lot of new institutional innovations in that process, but in actual practice, if you want to shift direction or you want to add something new, typically takes 2 or 3 years, sometimes an entire plan period in the old days to actually move things along. So in some senses, when we have to try and look at things in a comparative way, we have to take that into account. There's a huge lag in the Indian system, especially because we're large, we're complex, and we have multiple states to actually get this thing moving. So in some senses, it may be too early even now, 4 years down from the start of these programs, to actually look at how effective that they are. Typically, it takes us about 7 to 10 years for us to really look at things in a relatively objective manner. This is very unlike other parts of the world, including places like Indonesia, which are smaller countries than ours, who are able to move in a much more flexible and sort of rapid manner in some senses. So the reason that I laid that out was, I think it's important for us to look at this, and of course this is a very, let's say, biased or jaundiced view of it. This is a particular view. There are many other ways of looking at it. You can do it by sector and a whole range of other things. But I just thought that if we look at it, or you lay out a scaffolding, and there are many other things that I've left out, including the whole process of liberalization and how other things have worked. The big question for us, I think, is, do we proceed the same way incrementally, or do we actually look for a transformational jump? In a sense, the second generation programs are asking us to do that, but they themselves have a lot of fragmentation. It's really difficult. I mean, there are people who've actually managed these programs from the government of India. In many states, we have, at least from the public sector, and people from the private sector who are actually providing the infrastructure. So we hopefully we'll open up this thing about, in practice, is it better for us to go incrementally and in a diverse set of ways, or should we look for a set of big jumps, and in what directions can you make the jumps? We tried to make a number of jumps in the land space and we got a bloody nose, and there are a whole range of complexities. Sometimes the transformational imperatives create more problems than you started with, so you have to be careful about that. Similarly, in questions like energy, in some areas you're doing quite well, in other areas we've just not bitten the bullet. For example, many of us in the 90s worked extensively on power sector reform, and most of those questions are relevant today, but we've not been able to address the core political questions which are there, which are about loss on the demand side and dealing with the political economy of those processes. So irrespective of what sector you look, we have some commonalities. So having said that, I just sort of lay out very quickly some of the key things that I'm going to do this very, very quickly to sort of help frame the part of the discussion. I guess the big question that we don't ask very often just now, and I can say that having over the last many years, especially in the SDG process, worked in many parts of the world, is India actually has a very remarkable opportunity at this point of time of taking a different way forward. And when I say that, what do I mean? China is going towards hyper-urbanization. and it's going to hyper-urbanization in large clusters. So if you read the McKinsey reports, you start looking at China's own plan itself, they're going to clusters which should be 100, 150 million people. So if you look at, let's say, the Beijing-Tianjin axis, if you look at what's happening, around Hong Kong, and in southern China, you see similar kind of things. That's the way that they're going forward. They're really looking at how they can sort of draw as much as they can in terms of value addition, in terms of economies of scale from large agglomerations. Of course, they have many challenges because they're a very diverse country. About half of it is kind of desert, so they're concentrated in some areas. The Latin Americans have also hyper-urbanized. If you look at their growth from about the 50s to the 90s, now at most places at about 80-90% urbanization. The choice before us, and I think everything else is subsidiary, is really to actually embrace a more networked or more territorial kind of process. And the reason I say that, and we work on this quite a lot here, is that we still have about 6.5 lakh villages in this country. In a sense, people see that as as a liability in the urban space. In the rural or the political space, that's of course the predominant kind of thing that's there. The question that we have to ask is, how much of that will be there when we turn over in 2050 as a, let's say, 1.5 billion population? You know that by 2023 or so, we will overtake China in terms of population size, and we're still 1/3, 2/3 rural urban. So the question is, how do we keep that balance, and how do we keep that balance not only in terms of demographic process, but in terms of spatial structure? Because your infrastructure, your governance systems, how you lay out social processes, how you deal with inequality is critically related to that. And we do have a choice just now because of a whole range of things, and that's why I'm focusing so much in today's discussion on the question of climate. Because apart from anything else, what climate will actually constrain for us is two things that we have, or two or three things that we have real challenges in this country dealing with. The first one is obviously energy, right? So we are in an era of peak oil and peak gas. It will come quite quickly, and much of the kind of urban development that we've seen over the late 19th and certainly the 20th century has been driven by the availability of fossil fuels. Now that story is kind of over now, and if it's not over, then we're in deep trouble. Making the transition is very critical for us. So we don't have that advantage, excepting that we have a fair amount of coal and we have no oil and gas. If you look at the balance of payments issue, this is our biggest challenge. Inflation has historically been driven by the import of oil and gas, and when the oil and gas prices go up, this is obviously a critical and very sensitive political issue as you go out and look at oil and gas, let's say petrol and diesel prices. So we have no opportunities of using centralized sources of power for very long. So we have a great opportunity to use decentralized stuff, and as we can see just now, renewables are now touching about 10% rapid growth that's taking place. But will it be able to power the kind of processes that we need? Can it help the sort of the industrialization that we need to just supply goods and services for ourselves, apart from importing it from China? That's sort of one question that's there. The key thing, of course, is we have become much more networked. So if you look at the development of road networks, we can do it from satellite or otherwise. This is one of the big stories. In the 80s, I guess water was a big story, trying to provide universal water supply, and from the 90s onwards, actually making sure that, let's say, transportation networks, rail is not doing so well, but it's done better than it was, but certainly road networks have improved dramatically. And of course, fiber optic networks and communication have moved dramatically, and we've shown this too in earlier processes. So we do have the opportunity of running a different path that keeps a much more distributed network-based structure. And the 21st century, especially in the kind of technologies we're seeing, whether it's renewables or water management or even decentralized sewage or septic-based systems, are actually moving us in a different direction. So this is a strategic choice, and everything in a sense will derive from that. And as we know, we are a critically resource-constrained economy. From the ecological side, we have too little land, we don't have enough water. If we move in that direction rather than going into this large Delhi, Mumbai kind of thing, 30, 40 million people, we actually have an interesting way forward. But again, it's not a binary. Keep everybody in the villages, don't allow them to come to the cities, stop migration. That doesn't work. How to keep that balance and how to do that regionally is a very critical question for us. Then obviously the central question is governance. This is our biggest challenge. We are still framed in, I would say, in the imagination of the 1935 Government of India Act. That is not working for us just now. The 74th Amendment is just a beginning. I think in some senses, we have to move towards a strong political settlement to try and address these questions. If we don't, we're going to have a serious challenge, because money is less of a challenge anymore. The real thing is actually delivery, and delivery is not going to change unless the governance frame is going to change. This is our single most important challenge, whether it's on the political front, on the economic front, and absolutely the thing that we don't talk about in terms of social transformation and inclusion. The other thing that people don't talk about just much, because we've been focused so much on economic development and growth and stuff like that, is the question of social transformation. In my own sort of experience and the work that we do, this is probably the single most important question that has to be addressed in this country, and this is going to unlock most of our significant potential, whether it's on gender, on caste, on ethnicity. GST and all these things are just, in a sense, they're signifiers from a much wider range of questions. And if you look at the inequality in our country, and that's growing not only in income terms but in other terms, this is the most critical question. If we're able to address both of these things in some senses, I would imagine that the next question, which of course is all tied to this, will also in a sense be addressed. I mean, we are focused a lot on questions of employment, poverty, informality and inequality. These are sort of determinants of how both urban and rural development sort of work themselves out. Many of us who work across that spectrum. But if you don't get the frame correct, what is the structure of employment, how many people are going to be able to provide the food, are we going to be proceeding with a non-standard model because with a services-led economy, industry is relatively weak in our economic structure, but of course our demands are also quite significant. 1.5 billion people is like all the people on the planet about 100 years ago. Fine, so they're all concentrated in a very, very small area that's there. Then of course, the big and hard question, and I've broken it up into those three questions there. Funding, because some people just cannot afford, or some states and some locations cannot afford things without funding. The endogenous capacity to be able to raise resources and to be able to borrow even at low interest rates, even if they were there, just doesn't exist. So obviously there will be a whole range of people and processes that need to be funded, whether it's sector-wise or individuals. And then in an economy that's growing relatively quickly, how does one set up the financing mechanism to make this possible? Obviously there needs to be a tremendous amount of innovation in this space, around instruments, around what actors play in that space, etc. And then something that's actually a hard question, which in some ways has become unfashionable, but I think it's important to try and sort of focus on. And that is, we have maybe thrown the baby out of the bath with the bath water over the last 4 or 5 years. We have demolished, at least at the national level, our planning apparatus. Now, there were many issues with the planning apparatus. All of us know that. We worked within that frame. But the fact at the moment, in fact, last 2 days, I've just come in late last night from 2 days with the Finance Commission. The fact is that we do not have a mechanism in this very complex environment to actually coordinate, and more important, to contest and address questions of who gets more and who gets less, and how do you actually deal with performance. We don't actually have any coordination mechanisms, and the market doesn't work for most people in this country. They're not even connected to the financial sector. So there is a gap here. States in some cases still have some of that apparatus, but there's a gap in the framework just now that needs to be addressed. And it doesn't have to go back to the older frame that we had. I think we really have to reimagine this, and this is going to be a major sort of focal element, I think, of institutional innovation. So it's not that we have to recreate the planning commission and whatever, Niti Aayog is not good or bad or whatever. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that you do need to have mechanisms of coordination. We're a mixed economy. And we've lost that, and we're going to get desperately lost because we need to coordinate a whole range of processes simultaneously, and it's becoming more and more imperative to do that. And the market is not going to do that in an invisible process because of all of the range of challenges that we have. And fair enough, if you get all those 4 or 5 things together, the big challenge that we deal with, and this is why we exist as an institution, is the institutional capacity question. And in the urban space, it's really a big challenge. We just do not have the institutional capacity, and we don't have the professionals to actually fill this. And many of us have spent our lives trying to do this. We're trying to sort of multiply ourselves, clone ourselves, and do various things at many different places. But this is a fundamental challenge. This is one of the key reasons why delivery doesn't happen. We just don't have the institutions, and where we do have the institutions, they're either crumbling, or they're under assault, or there's contest happening. The institutional question is a very critical question that has to be dealt with. You cannot run and manage a democracy of this size without doing that. I mean, there's no historical precedence of doing it, and I hate to think of what would happen if there were a significant breakdown. We've seen what happened during partition, etc. Obviously, technology is very important in this process. It's something that gives us the ability to make changes very quickly. It does a whole range of things, but it has to be subservient to, at least in my experience, having been trained and practiced as a technologist, to a whole range of other questions. So I just laid this out because, I mean, this is just a laundry list. You could use any other list in some senses. We need to start thinking about these questions. We're talking about these questions very often. but we need to think about them in a much more structured manner, and all of them have to work together, because if they don't work together, there's no chance, whether it's the railways or it's the airport systems or it's energy systems or just plain tax collection or or delivery of infrastructure and managing of education, etc. It won't work without that. And finally, I mean, the key thing, of course, is the question of citizens and how they actually participate. And I think this is probably one of the most interesting things in which we go back and forth. There are a whole range of things that are changing. In some senses, the big push, which I think is fantastic, around Swachh Bharat is about one of the biggest behavior changes that we've seen since independence. Fine, it's a very, very hard thing to do. It's very complicated, and you can be instrumental about it and then find 5 years later when you review it objectively that it didn't work because you did the wrong things. But the core thing to that is really, and this is where India's great strength has been, I mean, from the last century onwards, is the call to collective action. Whether it's, some cases it may be a state-led call, which is the one that we are seeing with Swachh Bharat. Others it's coming from civil society. In other cases it's driven purely by innovation and by what the private sector has been able to provide. And in some senses, because we're such a complex and interconnected country, it's a mix of all of these things in different places. But till you get that mass mobilization, whether it's around a social cause or economic development or most important social transformation, things are not going to be able to change. That is our engine, which the Chinese in a sense don't necessarily have, and they have a different way of doing it. I mean, I'm continuing making the comparison because we started at a very similar stage many years ago, and as far as urban questions are concerned, we were on a similar footing, I would say 35 years ago when I started this discussion. So there are a whole range of mechanical things that need to be done, a whole range of systems. We work on them quite significantly. I wrap through them very quickly. Obviously, land is one of the core questions that we're dealing with. It's one of the most, I would say, one of our primary constraints in the urban space. Whether it's for industrial development or for housing or whatever it is, unless we address the land question, we're going to be stuck. And this is hard because this is deep political economy. This is 500 years of revenue systems. It's a whole range of other processes. There's real estate at the other end. Obviously, housing and buildings are very critical. We have a target-driven program just now that is meant to be one of the largest in the world. It is, I think, in my view, not going to do as well as it would like to because of the same structural mistakes that we made when we wrote the first housing policy in '89. We don't spend enough time talking about health, education and social protection, but these are the core drivers that enable the collective action and behavior change to happen. In fact, because we have not invested adequately in them, we're in deep trouble, and especially in urban health, we have a very serious challenge, which is not going away. There's a lot of work on environmental services. These are hitting us every day, whether it's air quality here or water or sanitation in other places. There's a lot of experience in the room on this. But the thing is that environmental services sit on top of ecosystem services. And we often disconnect them, even with people who actually know and work in the sector, because eventually what is really under stress at the moment and will become worse and worse because of climate and other questions is ecosystem services as the sort of as the boundary conditions change. Mobility and regional infrastructure are very important. We often forget about them, but that's a core driver of how urbanization actually works. And in a sense, if you tie together urban systems, it's labor markets, land markets, and things that connect them up in between, in one way of looking at it. Energy systems, like I said earlier, are a clear driver of these processes. We often forget about food and nutrition security, yeah? But the thing that brings civilizations down actually is food riots, fine? And we have a big challenge. This country has done remarkable things, going from 75 million tons to 275 million tons in terms of food grain production, but the green revolution has given us lots of other interesting unintended consequences, including this huge problem that we're having just now of NCDs. That's part of both of our lifestyle and other processes. So our solution is creating a whole range of other questions. These, we're such a complex society that doing something great in one place has an impact on other things, and if you don't think systemically, it doesn't work. And then, of course, if you don't have the framework of security in place and justice is seen to be done, then in some senses it doesn't work. And then finally, because there are too many of us and we're producing a whole range of crazy things into the environment, risk is becoming a very big question. So anyway, I just laid this out. This is a laundry list. We're not trying to address all these questions, but I'm just thinking that when we have to start thinking systemically, we have to start putting these questions together. So very quickly, I will zip you through this to sort of give you a sense of what's happening that we've done in the last 4 or 5 years. We've tried to work analytically, and I was just speaking to somebody just now. He's writing a book on this, on what is called new urban science. So this has been going on for 100 years. But the thing is, are there underlying drivers to drive this? This is something that came from our work about 3 or 4 years ago. What are the core things that drive urbanization? And in some senses, what we found very clearly is that basic services and housing is a key driver here, probably more than roads and power. And even though the telecom revolution is important, it's not so critical. The big challenge as far as economic development is concerned is inequality on the wealth side, which is then sort of reproducing the impact on the outcome side. Anyway, this is I'm just laying out means in some senses. This came to us 3 years ago. Then of course we did a lot of analytical work, and you'll start seeing this. What are the drivers? We're trying to drill down, looking holistically at both rural and urban areas, because as I said, India has the opportunity of keeping the balance. This is a new way of doing things. It requires both new theory and of course a lot of different practical solutions, whether it's in energy or water or transportation or even education as far as that's concerned. So you start doing analytical pieces of work on that. You start looking at what's driving this. We've done a lot of work on this regionally at trying to see what drives the social development outcomes. Again, you can see this is the proxy wealth index. Massive concentrations of wealth in the country, especially around urban centers. You can look at Mumbai, Bangalore, of course, in some senses larger than Chennai. So these things have been growing very quickly. Growth has many advantages, but it also creates challenges. And one of the questions, of course, is how much growth is enough, especially in context of inequality. This is, of course, a core question in welfare economics. But I think in spatial terms, this is very, very important, because you have to take from some to give to the other. It's a question of trying to build that solidarity. Again, a lot of analytical work that we did on that. Also, given the growth of the historical exclusion that we have in our society, and the question of what happens in a rapidly changing environment, looking at where people are, what happens to the kind of resources they control, and their own questions of social mobility. Again, very systematic work of trying to look at these questions. There are many other people in this context. And then of course, having looked at that, the question then is, how do you try and spatialize these processes? Because in economic development and planning theory and a whole range of other things, you can have stuff that looks at stuff sectorally. You can do some interesting mathematics. You can build programs around it. You can try and implement stuff. But the big challenge for us is to look at this process spatially. And more than the numbers in some senses, the spatial expansion of our cities. This is Chennai, for example. There are many people who come from Chennai here. Look at the growth of the red areas. The red areas are basically built up areas over time. And of course, we study that quite systematically here. And you can see how the expansion is taking place, how the growth may take place in the future. If you look at the red lines between 97 and 2017, over 20 years, you can see the growth of sort of built up areas. So the built up area is a good thing, but the question is, how is this trying to achieve the kind of things that we're dealing with? How does one actually manage the peri-urban and urban transition? And what are the best forms of infrastructure, provisioning, policy that actually drive this thing? So we have a lot of instruments to deal with this, but they're quite challenging dealing with stuff. Similarly, this city, you can see massive growth taking place in various contexts, similar kind of trends in some senses. So even though India is not, people talk about the urban explosion, actually our urbanization rates are not as high as they should. There's a big debate just now about whether, depending on, we've written a lot on that, whether the numbers are closer to 30 or more, closer to 40, etc. Those are definitional questions. A lot of the scholars are in the room. But the more important question, I would think, is how are we actually managing that fabric? Yesterday we had a very interesting discussion in the Finance Commission on Kochi, given all that had happened. And how can you manage? I mean, of course, the city has grown and it's changing in various different ways. Kerala is a wonderful example of this sort of urban development, this balanced frame that we're talking about. But in spite of that, because of the frame, and you can see this very clearly in many locations. Look at this outgrowth that's satellites in some senses are useful for us. The question, one of the questions was, how can you think of, and this is not the only city that's done it, of actually locating our airport, and it's a PPP airport, it's not even a government airport, fine, in a location which that's going to be flood prone. I mean, and we've done this not in one city but many others. So where were the checks and balances? Is it completely driven by real estate interests, or planning breakdown, or whatever it is? Kerala's got a long history of dealing with decentralized development in some senses. But they are, and you can see that. What's driving this? Look at this growth of built up area, given the kind of environment you're talking about, and the risk profile. So it's wonderful to see how things have responded, how the state government has done great things in trying to deal with stuff. But the question is, if you could have avoided some of that stuff, it may not have been a bad thing. So having said that, I mean, this is just sort of a quick history of intellectual history of what we've done in the last few years. I will sort of close this section by looking at the question of the Sustainable Development Goals. For better or for worse, we have half accepted or not accepted that, certainly at the national level. Niti Aayog is responsible for trying to track this process. We're obviously reporting on this internationally. But for the first time, you do have a framework which tries to deal with all of these mad things we're talking about. Okay, many of us will not agree with it. In fact, Goal 11 that I've sort of circled in red here was actually negotiated in this room many years ago. But the thing is that we do have a political agreement in many parts of the world that this is a good thing to do. It's too many things, it's confused, it's all over the place. But there's a framework to look at it. And what we've done, and I think we'll just release the document on that, is we've done a somewhat systematic job of trying to, so to trying to look at all of these goals. In fact, maybe I'll go back for a second. So there are 17 of them. They're pretty obvious in some senses. Basically what we're saying is by 2030, and this is an imperative for India, we have to end extreme poverty, or at least all poverty. We have to sort of end hunger, that's number 2. We've got to make sure universal healthcare is available. This is a very critical question, very challenging in India at the moment. We have to make sure that quality education is available at school level at least. We're trying to deal with that at higher education level, but school level is available for everybody. Gender equality is a big contest and a very, very critical question. One of the key drivers for us, as less and less women in the Indian workforce are actually who are educated are joining the Indian workforce, a big issue as far as India is concerned. Clean water and sanitation got a lot of political mileage in India, and we're making some progress in that. Again, on the energy side, we're making progress in some areas, but we are stuck on others. Our big challenge here is number 8, about work. This is the big challenge that we've had now for 15 years, and it's not going away. In fact, it's getting worse. I don't know how it's going to play out in the elections, but this is a critical question. Obviously, a lot of emphasis on industry and infrastructure and how we're dealing with it. There again, we're not doing very well in India. Inequality, of course, is growing quite significantly here. I mean, in some ways, unfortunately, we thought we were different from Latin America, but even though we don't have the kind of urbanization levels that they have, our income inequalities, our Gini's are growing in most sectors. Then, of course, there's an urban thing that sort of notionally brings together many of these questions, especially around transport and housing. And then you have a whole range of environmental goals, including climate, dealing with terrestrial and aquatic and marine resources, and of course the big institutional questions of bringing it together. So this is the frame that people have agreed to. There are a whole set of indicators and other processes that that support that. So basically, what we've done here, and the document is available to you, is we've actually gone and done an indexing of different states across the country, all the states in fact, across these goals. And again, there's no value judgment in this. This is an index, and indexes have lots of problems, and there are lots of data issues there. But if you look at the perceptions in some senses, you have Goa at the top, you have Bihar at the bottom, fine. The key thing here, of course, is how to turn reds into sort of different shades of orange and yellow, and then of course turn things into greens. That's really in the sense of what we're doing. And the challenge for us is you have to do it across the entire row. Okay, so if you look at India's situation, I'm not showing it to you just now. Globally, we are way down in the rankings. The rankings are not important, but the fact for us is how do we take some of our most populous states, so that's Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, etc., and of course other states that are challenged, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh are going to election just now, and transform them step by step so that we're able to track them. So the numbers are not important, in some senses the colors are not important, but the process and the institutional thing of keeping the balance across those processes, interconnecting them. The value of this frame is it's very well interconnected. So if you do something on health, it has an impact on population, it has an impact on welfare and productivity and a whole range of things that are there. So we have a way of measuring this.
Tell us something about indicators and data collection.
Yes, so I mean the stuff is there. In fact, Doctor, you'll get a copy of this thing. Where am I going? Yeah, so you asked that question, Samir, about indicators. That's the whole set that's there, fine.
How are they different from the ministry's indicators?
These are benchmarked to the UN standards as much as we could. There isn't a very significant difference from what the ministry is using. But I think the interesting thing that we've tried to do here, and I'll just show you the last set of slides after this, is that it's very difficult to unbundle the urban space. There's a lack of data and a whole range of parameters that are there. I mean, just a very simple question. Economic output as far as our cities are concerned is something that we're just starting to look at. That's a big shift that many of us have been trying to do for a long time. If you don't actually have economic output at the city level, you can't actually drill down and look at stuff even further. So there's a lot of stuff inside there. But I guess the key thing that, and this is a provocation more than anything else. I'm not saying that one state is better than the other. But the core question is, how can we manage across all, and how can we really especially lift the floor? Lifting the floor is a big, big question. And then the question then is, how do you prioritize investment? So I mean, by the looks of it, there's lots of red in that. And there are good reasons for the red. Of course, you can change the indicator and the red will change a little bit here and there. That's not the question. The question is that we're in the red in lots of spaces. We have to make a lot of effort as far as that's concerned. What this does mean is, institutionally, we need coordination across processes, and we need vertical integration at the same time. And that's hard, and like we said earlier, looking at the history of urban programs, we're not very good at that. We don't have people to do it, we don't have the institutional frame to do it, and now we don't even have the structure to actually keep that going. So, yeah. So if I just look at this at the macro level, in fact, I was just discussing this with Dr. Ravindra, looking at urban and non-urban areas, we cannot do the city level stuff because there isn't enough data. We can do it for a few. Even there, we've tried it for a city like Bangalore. We're building an observatory for the city to do this. There's a big challenge there. Which are the goals that we're doing better than most? On poverty, we're doing better in urban areas than in other areas. Gender equality is better. Again, this is sort of obvious. Sanitation and water, we're doing better. On energy access, we're doing better. Obviously, institutional capacity is better. So this is the one of the problem areas. So on questions of hunger, there are some considerable issues on this. People have been dealing with this thing for a long time. Amitabh has been writing about this for quite a while. Similarly, the thing that's a little surprising is that as far as education is concerned, depending on what states you look at, and because of the large populous states, things are different. So we're having a challenge even in education and educational access in urban areas in many parts of the country. This seems kind of contradictory because, as you will see later or tomorrow, much of our higher education infrastructure is concentrated in urban areas. So there's a sort of neither here nor there thing on education, which is a matter of great concern. Employment obviously is a big question. And if employment is not doing better in urban areas, then we're in deep, deep trouble. Again, this is something we've known for a long time. There's been a long debate about jobless growth. There are a whole range of macroeconomic constraints that are actually constraining this. But to my mind, one of the core questions there is, if we do not focus on our smaller towns, there's no chance in hell that we're actually going to deal with this question. And that means, of course, dealing with a whole range of infrastructure and governance questions. Again, if you look at the expansion of programs, JNU, I'm sitting at about 60 odd. Now you're growing it to maybe 1,000 other places. Those 2,000 places are the pivotal places for the country, but we're not actually working adequately on that. And the big constraints are institutional, financials of course, but institutional constraints being very critical. And then of course inequality is growing. That is pretty clear. It's growing between states, it's growing between regions, it's growing between population groups inside that. And that is a matter of very great concern. So, while urban areas should be driving this process, they're not actually doing that. Health is a very serious challenge, and we all know this. It's an unspoken fact. As this dual sort of transition is happening, and we're working increasingly on this with WHO and otherwise, we do not have an urban health system that actually works for us. We're trying to transplant a system that is sort of half working or not working in rural areas into urban contexts. This is a bomb that's kind of sort of, it's going off as we speak in some senses. So this is pretty clear from the macro data. And then to answer Sameer's questions, there's a whole range of other things in which we actually don't have good data, fine, because the data systems are not there. On infrastructure, typically, we're sitting at the moment with a $2 trillion economy, and we're self-reporting on a whole range of processes. Now, it's great that we self-report. We didn't have self-reporting earlier, so that's a great way of moving forward. It's a very pragmatic way of knowing our processes, but we have less and less objective ways of looking at how infrastructure and service delivery levels are working. Again, as I said, most of the innovators in the room on sustainable production and consumption, you can forget it. The example of that is pretty much wherever you go in the country. If you go to a small town or a large village, as soon as you come inside, you see plastic. I mean, that's the most obvious thing that you see apart from other things. Obviously, climate is a key question as far as it's concerned. On environmental questions, we have lots and lots of challenges, and they're going to get worse. They're not going to get better. At the current point of time, the turnover is not happening. So that's, in a sense, a quick frame of what we should kind of be looking at. Dr. Ravindra has kindly agreed to come in and release the report that we produce on this. Again, it's an offering. There'll be lots of debates on it, and you can change all the indicators and do whatever it is. But basically, we have a real problem, and the problem is complex. It cannot be solved by simple incremental siloed methods. It will require integration. We don't have the institutions to do that at the moment. we don't have the people to sort of actually run those institutions, and even if you put money into the process, it's such a leaking bucket that it won't work. So that's first section. I've taken a little time, but I thought maybe if you can, people have some quick reflections before I move on to the second one, then we can have a discussion. Jagu.
One of the SDGs that ought to have been there, which unfortunately is not an explicit SDG. So if you have, for example, SDG 14 is life underwater, which is exclusively dealing with marine biodiversity, marine resources and all. There's no equivalent for freshwater ecosystems. Yeah. And so that's where the trade-off is likely to be with the diversion of rivers, the loss of artisanal fisheries, which also provides protein for very marginalized communities, yeah. Resilience against climate change induced changes. That's where I think a lot of the trade-offs, and as we see that SDG doesn't exist, we need to include it in some other way and see the trade-offs and synergies with some of the other SDGs.
Absolutely, I wouldn't agree with you more. Many things were lost in that negotiation. It was a political frame that's there. It has many issues with it, and this is one of the key things that we look at when we're starting to look at integrated systems. I wouldn't agree with you more on that. Any other sort of quick comments, clarifications, issues? Yeah, please. We'll just, yeah.
You did speak about reimagining.
Yeah.
Reimagining the institutional development process. So just a thought that just flashed in my mind I would like to share with you and get your comments is that you spoke about we are urban with a rural imagination. So I somehow feel to the contrary. I feel we are rural, primarily, predominantly a rural agrarian economy. We should be, I'm sharing my should be too, but with a rural imagination. Along with it, when you showed the watersheds and also the challenges, something that struck me was liberalization, you mentioned it some way, is going parallelly with the birth of the urban development programs, with the constitutional amendment that took place. So somehow I feel maybe if we have to reimagine, can we look back at what went wrong in those two areas?
Okay, good. Let's pick up a few responses. Yeah. Chandrawan.
A very interesting point that you made was about urban health. This is a small insight that I gathered over a period of time. I worked with the Chennai Corporation in 2 stints. In my first stint, I was Deputy Commissioner Health. In the second stint, which was many years later, maybe 15-20 years later, I came in as Commissioner. Why this is important is, as Deputy Commissioner Health, we used to regularly do a morbidity profile analysis. In Chennai, those days, the most important public health problems that were coming across to the corporation to address was diarrheal diseases, respiratory infections, and common ailments. This was the morbidity profile of Chennai 15-20 years ago. Recently, about a year ago, when I was Corporation Commissioner, I happened to look at the figures and numbers again. Infectious diseases as a cause of morbidity in Chennai had gone down substantially. What had taken the cake was chronic lifestyle diseases of diabetes, hypertension, and heart attacks. So the entire morbidity profile of the city had changed dramatically in 2 decades. Now, what is the challenge and the implication for the health system? Our system of primary, secondary, and tertiary healthcare has always been designed for a large focus on infectious diseases and infectious disease control. Now, if you are talking about imagining and putting in place an urban healthcare system, our paradigm will completely shift, because now you have to address lifestyle diseases and chronic diseases, where it has 2-3 implications. One, the action has to start with health promotion and disease prevention, which is actually the key to these strategies. The second is, once a person develops these diseases, he requires a lifetime of care and support and perhaps some tertiary interventions, which essentially means the investments will be higher, the process and institutional care and also the kind of people that need to be deployed will be totally different. Our health systems are still not recognizing this particular paradigm shift, and we are yet to work in that direction to re-engineer and redesign our health systems to move in that direction. Was something that I thought I'll
Thank you. No, this is very important. I think we're good. We're opening up this debate just now because it helps in,
Yeah. Thank you, Aro, as usual, for a fantastic overview. I really like that SDG framework because it, of course, compresses massive amounts of data and analysis into one page. And I was wondering if you could have underneath it an institutional framework that will help the transformation and start giving ratings on those. And by that, also starting to outline what are the absolutely minimum necessary steps and transitions that they would need to go through to start seeing an impact up there. And some states may have achieved some basic pieces of the institutional capacity and a little bit of professionalization, and others are much further behind. But maybe we need to start articulating a little more clearly and in bite-sized or understandable pieces how to unpack this transforming the institutional capacity and professionalism that's required to flip those other ones.
Okay, thanks. That's a very important point. I don't think we have a framework to start doing this. I think many of us have worked on this, but even if you were to pick it up in one city and then one state and actually lay this out, this is one of our most important challenges. And then, of course, it ties in with, it takes time to build institutions. It takes decades in some senses. Any other quick things? Otherwise, I'm going to change gears and move to another set of things. Yeah, but sorry.
See, in each state, if you can put what is actually pulling the state down.
Yeah.
Okay, or whatever units which you're taking, or district, or these things, no?
It's a mix of a whole range of things. I mean, many of the things are quite well known. It's not that we don't know them. The question is that we now have at least a framework, for better or for worse. The plan is to do that in any case, where you could look at it in one thing and say, oh my God, things are not doing so well. And how do you move this to whatever? Actually, the challenge for us is we have to drill this down, like Sumila is saying, from state, which is great, and to the district and to the sub-district to make it work. I mean, you need this at block level, but our statistical systems don't work, and you need this, and we're doing this work in other places, like many people in this room. Even in a city, a large metropolitan region, you need this at ward or sub-ward level to actually operationalize it. The operationalization really, we have a big missing middle issue here, not on the institutional front, but just on the statistical front, to figure out what the hell is happening. And if you don't actually track this stuff, you don't know where you're going. And what I'm showing you is just a snapshot. What you need to have really is a trajectory. I mean, hopefully next year or the next year after that, you really want to have an arrow that's going up or down in those spaces, because you want to know how that thing is changing. Because if you have a target or you want to get somewhere in 15 years time, and your institutional constraints are very critical, you have to do that step by step. You can't, wish it away and say, okay, I've got something and we're going to sort things out, etc., etc., etc. Just put on the next one very quickly. So these provocations are very important. I think, as we build up and have these conversations, whether it's on health or land or institutional processes, or questions of, in a sense, a political economy. I mean, this is an old debate that, and Narendra is sitting here also. You're absolutely right that we are a country which is not only rural in its imagination, we're rural in caste, in all the other nice things that rural areas bring to us. But the fact is that transition is happening. The question is, how do we imagine that transition to happen? Do we want to really become, to take a meme, Singapore or Shanghai? Could we ever become that? And who's going to do that? And what is the imagination for the middle? The question for us and the opportunity for us is in a sense in the small town. This is the second thing. Yeah, very good. Okay, great, good. Okay, I'm going to shift gears completely and show you something which I think is, where are we? Back. Okay, I'm going to show you something which is really hot off the press. And the reason I'm doing this is, many of us have co-created it here. We have at least 3 or 4 authors of this process in the room. This is sort of something that is at the back of some people's mind, but actually is a critical global emergency, and is going to impact us irrespective of what we talk about. And this is something that cuts across urban and rural areas. What are you doing? How did that come up there? I want the same presentation up here on that side. So I'm going to describe, no, I want the same one here. I'm going to describe something that was produced about a month a little bit more than a month ago. It's got a lot of attention globally. It is the IPCC's report on the 1.5 target. Just give you a little bit of context. Most of us know that climate change is an issue. People have been working on it for a long time. The IPCC has been doing this for 30 years. Some of us have been part of that process. Jagdish is here, Amir is here, another colleague, Chandni Singh. So we have a number of Indian authors working on this question. Basically, in 1992, there was an attempt to address this question through a global agreement. So in a global agreement that essentially said one very simple thing. There's a certain amount of carbon that you can put into the atmosphere and other such things. And because it's a tragedy of the commons, we should slice it up and divide up how much should go to different parts of the world. That didn't work. So in 1992, when many of us were in Rio, we were at about 0.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average. So this is a baseline number that starts, let's say, in the 19th century. There was a half a degree increase in temperatures. And there was obviously some concern. We could start seeing some things happening. There was still a big debate at that point in time whether climate change was happening or not. Okay, it's taken us 25 years. We have some of the country's leading climate and atmospheric scientists in the room. Basically, we've added another half degrees. And we're in deep trouble just now because it seems like the other half degree is baked in. So there was a lot of brouhaha about this. And in Paris in 2015, somehow or the other, all the countries in the world said, this is something very serious, we've got to do something about it. Now, the challenge at that point of time is, throughout the 90s and otherwise, the IPCC and the science was saying that 2 degrees was about the outer limit of what we can do. I led the chapter in the last assessment on urban areas where cities became important. It was not really looked at very significantly before that. And even there, we were saying, we were measuring impact against 2. And then a very interesting thing happened. Well, 2 things happened. First is, some of the least developed countries, and we used to be like that, but we apparently are not anymore. We are a low middle income country, who are really experiencing serious challenges of drought and inequality and livelihood issues. Let's say if you look at Horn of Africa, that's a classic example. They said, guys, this is not working at all for us. It's not going to work. We're in desperate crisis. We cannot accept 2 is too much. And then very obviously the small island states, a whole range of them like the Maldives and many of them in the Pacific, said a very basic thing. We will cease to exist, and that will start happening well before sea level rise hits us by the end of the century. They're saying existentially 2 degrees is too much. So towards the end of the negotiations in Paris, they said, okay, the Paris Agreement says we should try and keep below 2 degrees, but there was a push to say we should try and hold it to 1.5. So when that happened, there was actually very little science in the room. Nobody really looked at 1.5. There were some, people at the margins, the last 10%, all the outliers in the science process, who were looking occasionally at 1.5. Most of us were looking at, 2 and 2.5 or 3, things that are nice to do from the climate science side because you get very good signals for big overshoots. But suddenly, because of the political process, they couldn't handle the negotiations in Paris. Essentially, the FCCC process, the countries said, okay, we'll outsource this problem to the IPCC. And they said, okay, you guys figure out what will happen if we actually set a 1.5 target. And that was a crazy moment. Many of us were sort of involved in trying to frame that discussion because the science community actually didn't have any evidence. But what's happened subsequent to that is actually quite interesting. This is a report that was released on the 8th of last month after a very tough negotiation. This is probably going to be one of the key scientific reports of this decade. I would expect many thousands of citations. It was a remarkable process because, like I said, when we started, there was pretty much no literature put together by 90 odd authors from 40 countries. The interesting thing for us is this is now based on about 6,000 research papers that have come out in the last 2 years on this question. So this is interesting. This is a new wave in some senses where science across the world, or evidence-based policy, in spite of what many countries are saying about this stuff, is actually built up and sort of building out in this. But more important for us, and this drove us completely crazy, was this is one of the most significantly reviewed pieces of work. So we've done this in the last year and a half, went completely nuts. But there are 42,000 comments that have come from expert reviewers and countries across the world. So this is obviously a key question. And in the IPCC frame, for those of us who run research papers, you do a research paper in Nature and maybe you get 100 comments and you think it's really tough. We have to actually respond to these 42,000 comments. The responses are all publicly out there. Kapil is doing this, he's reviewing this as one of his jobs to review this process for one of the special reports that's coming out. Jagdish is actually leading this thing. So when it was released, it was actually unbelievable because there were 30,000 media reports in the last month on this report. So suddenly somewhere, at least on some counts, the penny has dropped. So I'm just going to give you a quick sort of synopsis of what's happening there and why it's important for cities. So I guess the key question for us is, why are cities sort of important in this? Obviously, we've talked about this, is obvious to us. In the larger world, even in the climate world, cities don't exist. They didn't exist till very recently, I would say 5 to 10 years ago. So obviously cities are important because they're places of opportunity, they're places of enterprise and hope among a whole range of challenges. We know about this. But they're also places which concentrate deep inequality. From Latin America, we can do hundreds of different examples from us. They also are places of contest for a better life and a better world. This is Cairo. We can have very similar things. We haven't had this kind of stuff for a long while, but I don't know what's going to happen over the next few months that are there. Because cities give you the ability to be able to aggregate at a scale that we actually don't understand. But they also are places where climate transformation can actually be made. This is from Aman. Because of the fact that you have so many things happening, you have so much of institutional, cultural, and of course technological and other innovation. Now, the funny thing, of course, and we don't often see this because it's hidden, those of us who work on energy, is that the urbanization that we have today is significantly driven because of the availability of fossil fuels. So India actually has, you're absolutely right, has a rural structure. In fact, for 1,000 years, our urban structure has not changed very much. We've hardly added 100 new towns in the last 100 years. In other parts of the world, it's changed dramatically, and the key driver for that is the availability of energy. Because earlier it was for slaves, to put it badly, and then a whole range of mobile power that's coming from animals that actually drove this process. So in some senses, the Industrial Revolution and all the stuff that we created and the availability of energy are very, very closely tied to each other. Fine. So cities and energy, in a sense, created the Industrial Revolution. But this process has created an environment in which we have a lot of things that are interesting, but some of them have serious challenges, including mobility of this form. This form of mobility is actually pathological in some senses, and that's driven by this idea that we have an unlimited supply of fossil fuels. And this is very important to understand, because when we look at the world today, the reason that the climate accord didn't work or the processes from Kyoto, etc., didn't work was there was a discussion going on between a few nation states and a few large corporations. Maybe 24 on both sides. And that discussion didn't permeate further. The reason that the process actually turned its way around, starting with the failure in Bali and then in Copenhagen, when the US and the Chinese presidents came in to make a deal and they couldn't do it, was that you have to address these questions in a bottom-up manner. So the real challenge for us is to, just like in our urbanization process, is to link the top down. You need to do it. If you don't bring the oil majors inside and the gas majors inside, it's not going to work. Because they have the capital, they have the technology, they have the ability to be able to manage these huge supply chains. But on the other hand, if you don't deal with the bottom-up processes, it won't work either. Because all your new technologies and new processes are going to be bottom-up. So building that scaffolding in between is the real global challenge, and cities are going to be the central part of that process. So basically, cities have been very, very successful, driven by both economic development and otherwise. And what's the evidence of that? Some of you have seen this graph, this 1950, cities across the world, 0.75 billion people, economic size of just 3 trillion, fine, just after the war. And they grew, and then they grew. And that's what the number was like in 2010, 30 trillion, 10 times more. You can see where they are, fine. But actually, the real story is not there. The real story is, this is the great aspirational future that we're selling to our people. This is the new imagination, etc., etc. This is of course Singapore, which is a classic example, singularity in some senses, driven by fossil fuel, central as far as that's concerned. And then this is where we're going. This is the end of the SDGs. This is the current projections that are there. A 90 trillion economic size, 5 billion people all over the place. Okay, and we're part of that process. What we're talking about just now, that transition, even at this point of time, India will be like 40% plus at the current census definitions, not 50% depending on how you actually work. But the real story is economic development story here. Okay, so that incremental between in 20 years is like $30 trillion. You divide one by the other, and you know that we're adding about $1 trillion plus per year. That's half of India's economic size globally. And a lot of this is driven because of the productivity that cities generate, and a lot of that is driven by how we use our resources. The challenge, of course, is this. I picked this up in the morning before I came in here. Those are global SO2 emissions from satellite stuff that we see. Fine. I'm not doing PM temp. I can do all of them. All of this is available now. We have satellites that can track this stuff. We can show it to you live. There's no issues as far as that's concerned. So basically, if you zoom into them, you can't see them very clearly. It's not what I could zoom in, otherwise you can zoom in right down. Each of these things in a sense is one of our major industrial production sites. Those are our big coal and other plants that are there. And this is sort of, and you can see what's happening in Western. So this is the factory of the world. This I don't know, I mean, we're neither the factory of the world nor the service center of the world. But basically we have very, very, very serious challenges as far as this is concerned. And I'm not even showing you carbon dioxide. So this whole process of urbanization and resource consumption that's there is having massive impacts across the global environment. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people also. We're going to hit, well past 10 billion or maybe 9.5 because of the dynamics as far as that's concerned. So it's only going to get worse, it's not going to become better. So the real question for us, especially those of us in the climate space or the urban space, is that these are not our real stranded assets. And some of us will recognize this, it's from not very far. This is not our stranded asset. That is, coal-fired power plants are the things that are locked in for 30 or 40 years, and once you build them, it becomes crazy to take them out of action. This is what the Chinese have been doing. They were building 10 plants a week for a long period of time. They're now starting to take off 40 gigawatts a year at the moment of their coal-fired stuff. They're really moving very, very dramatically in this space. But of course, they're smart. They're not stupid. They will take them and sell them, maybe not to us because we won't buy them, but they'll sell them to other people. They have 20 years of residual life. So, etc. as far as they're concerned. So our real stranded assets, and the reason why I'm saying it's a stranded asset is financially these things don't work anymore because of all the challenges that we have. Our real stranded assets are not coal-fired power plants. They're actually our cities. I mean, think about it. If you have to move a city backwards from a shoreline by, let's say, a kilometer, think like a plant or animal, by about 2 kilometers every 5 years or 10 kilometers every decade. That's a hell of a big thing to do. We've never done that before. Small things have happened. You build shorelines, you do this. The Dutch are, great masters at this process. But this is what we'll have to do. There are no options at the moment. Half of incremental humanity is living within 50 kilometers of a low elevation coastal zone. This is a big risk that we have. I mean, you shouldn't be buying property in lots of Bombay, for example, even if Bombay had big seawalls. So we're in deep trouble here, and our trouble is in this. So this is our growth driver. This is a solution to the problems of economic development, of education, our health, in spite of everything that we have. That's the way forward. But they're really stuck. So in some senses, cities, and this came, this is what I spoke about at the U20 summit about 10 days ago. Cities in some senses are the great opportunity. They're also our big challenge. So yes, we got the SDGs, and then we got Paris. This was really hardly fought. It was very, very tough. It was remarkable that it actually happened. And then, of course, this is what we cleared. You can see the dates there on the 6th of October. This is the IPCC working group thing, which actually says we really have to try for 1.5 because 2 is going to have horrible consequences. But it's damn hard to do it because we're already at 1. Okay. Now, the thing that most people don't talk about, and I was talking to Rashmi, Dr. Rashmi last year. He was our major negotiator at Copenhagen, etc. He's retired just now. The thing that people don't tell you about Paris is what the countries agreed to was not to get us to 2. They agreed through a whole range of voluntary contributions to get us to somewhere between 2.9 to 3.4. This is the hidden story about Paris. Fine. This is what the Paris Agreement says. Why? Because we went from a top-down process that didn't work to saying, okay, everybody does whatever they want, we agreed to how to do it, and then we'll ratchet up processes over time. So it's not 2. What India's agreed to, and we are saying we're going to hit 2 out of our 3 targets and all that kind of stuff, is actually to get us to 2.7. And when we did the assessment of urban areas in 2014, published report that said chapter 8, we assessed some large cities, New York, London, but also some small ones like Durban, Dar es Salaam. And what we found was very, very shocking. And that was that in the 2070s, if we continue where we're going just now, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. London will have 10 years more, New York may have 10 years more because one has the Thames barrier, someone else has a good water supply that's connected. But basically, once you go beyond the 2 barrier, the ecosystem services start collapsing. Basically, agriculture, which has sustained us for 5,000 years, we don't know how to manage agricultural systems. We have some of the best electrician people in the country who work on livestock and agriculture. We just don't know how to do it. There's no historical precedence. We don't have the cultural understanding to do it. We don't have the technological understanding how to do it. And it isn't a question of fancy tech, that's it. And what we've agreed to do is way, way beyond that. Okay, so what's the messages from this thing? And I thought it's useful to share. The first thing is we're currently at 1. It's a clearly established fact, no questions, no discussion about this. Okay, and the trend is there. People can say whatever they want. That's the reality that's there. The fact is that we're adding at about 0.2 degrees per decade. So basically, we're going to hit 1.5 at the median run things. The range is whatever it is by the late 2030s. So this is a very interesting story here. Since the 1980s, all this grand sustainable development stuff has been based on the idea, and Brundtland set out this idea, that it's all about our children. We're doing this for our children, because if you don't do this, our children are going to live a terrible life, etc. The fact is that's no longer true anymore. So Brundtland was right. Of course we're doing it for our children. But what the climate engagement is saying, and this is physics here that's speaking in many cases, and photochemistry and a whole range of things, is that we will see the impact of our actions in our lifetime. Because most of us, I would imagine, in spite of whatever, the health transition, are going to probably live another 4,000 days. And that's what it takes to get us. I mean, the overshoot will happen maybe in about 8,000 days or so. So that's a sobering news. This will happen in our lifetime. The choices that we make will be very critical to us, apart from all the other messy things that we having to live with at the current point of time. So there are many things that we can do. It's not only about carbon, there are many other things. This is very important for India and especially for urban areas, those of us who work on transport, etc. It's also about methane, because methane makes, these are long-term pollutants, they have a tremendous impact. Black carbon is critical. I mean, some of us have come from Delhi yesterday. A lot of the stuff that we're seeing there is black carbon related. So if you fix this, it means a tremendous change. The SO2 emissions that I show you were a signifier for this other stuff. If you get this stuff sorted, it actually makes sense. And this is a big urban question that's there. So you can actually bend the curve a lot by focusing on things that are apart from the carbon. So what does it mean in practice? What it means in practice is that we have to reach net zero. That basically means that we have to basically transform the single largest industry that the world is based on at the moment, the oil, gas, and within our country, within brackets, the coal industry. We have to transform that industry so that in the next 30 years or under 32 years or so, we have to move completely to renewables. There is no choice as far as that's concerned. If we want to stay at 1.5, there is no choice as far as that's concerned, which basically means as a civilization, as a planet, we have to reduce our current emissions by about 70% by 2030. Because there's also growth in between. That doesn't mean India has to do this, and this is a big fight as far as we're concerned. How much space do we have, how is it to be done? But the fact is that this transformation is coming, and it's inevitable because of the kind of impacts that we'll have. Because basically what we're saying, the science is very clear about this. If we don't do this, we will have an overshoot. The question is, how much will the overshoot be? Will it be 2? Will it be 2.9? Will it be 3? We actually don't know. It depends on our choices it makes. And what is clear is the overshoot will not be for 5 years. It will be for decades. Fine. So the question is, how do you contain the overshoot? And the only way that we know how to contain the overshoot, okay, is either faster CO2 reductions, which means you're going to go to much more aggressive processes. We're doing remarkable things on, doing 10 gigawatt, solar power plants and stuff like that. But that's just not enough. Why? Because of this. So this is what the report says, and I don't want to scare the hell out of you, but basically I just picked up a few things that are there. This is a global report. It's not about India. We didn't have enough evidence to pull together something of the region. This is not what we were asked to do. Just look at this row here. This basically says 1.5 degrees. This is, there will be about, let's say, 30-40 million people affected because of reduced yields, and of course Africa and Asia. Look at the difference between 1.5 and 2. It's an order of magnitude. Got it? So when the message we're sending out is, it's not about, so the message that the IPCC is trying to send is every degree matters. Actually, it's not every degree. It's every tenth of a degree that matters. Every little thing you do that matters, because a lot of the people are going to be affected, and this is current science. It's only 2 years old. As we do more and more stuff, I suspect, Geeta Lakshmi is not here, this number is going to be larger than this. It's probably not going to come down. Okay? There are going to be about 500 million people affected directly in the agriculture sector. And it's highly non-linear, as you can see in this process. Apart from other, other more exciting things around health, around water, 500 million people, let's say. This is the best science we have. Like I said, in the chapter that I led on implementation, 3,000 citations. When we started the chapter, we thought we'll have 500. We actually have 3,000 citations. So this is very well agreed. There are a few questions around the margins, but that's the core question. This is what we have to avoid. So it's not only a question of India's development, It's also, we are going to be one of the most significantly impacted regions, both in rural and urban areas, and those of us who work on rural distress can already see the signals of this happening. We have an extensive research team that does this kind of work here, looking at migration and impact and stuff like that. So this is, in a sense, the choice that we have. So basically, the science message here is very clear. This overshoot would push a number of natural and human systems beyond their limits of adaptation. You'll go to a position that you cannot come back from. I mean, the causes are most obvious, but in our context, given the kind of pressures we have a really, really critical question. And the question is not only about the technology, the basic issue is we do not have the institutional or the governance experience of dealing with this question before. It's never existed in all of the last 5,000 years that we have a little bit of other processes. All the biologists and ecologists here will tell you that. But the real question is institutional and governance. So the only way to address this is a question, once you go to overshoot, the only way to deal with it is take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Fine. Now it may seem like a cool thing, and we're saying that in our report. The big challenge is, in the Indian context, there are only two ways to do that. There are land-based solutions, which basically mean that to reforest and add soil carbon, etc. For us, given our current agrarian context, it means conflict. As it is, we have conflict around water, around land, a whole range of other things. I mean, all of the agrarian stuff that we're having. If you want to add gigatons, this is a gigaton range kind of sequestration we're talking about. We're talking about massive conflict, whether it's biofuel production or reforestation or afforestation, etc., etc. And this has been done with very, very significant science. Jagdish is leading this in a very concrete way in the next assessment. So the question is, can we make and so the questions are, okay, this is, we're all dead, so forget it, let's not do anything about it. So actually what the report says is, we have the technical options to do with it. The real challenge is, and we can maybe do it, but we need to really enable a massive, massive mobilization across the world. And this is the big debate, and that's why I was speaking at the G20 meeting, is the countries can't do it on their own. They tried. Okay, it's like we were flying an aircraft. Hopefully it's a twin engine aircraft. So we have to change one engine as we're flying, at least. That's your prime driver of any system. The problem is not that you have to change the engine and you're flying at the same time, somebody's got to go out on the wing and change it. The problem is the guys who are flying the aircraft, the countries and the large transnationals, okay, they're only talking to each other and they've shut the door to the cockpit. And they've been doing that for 25 years. And the messages from the cockpit is everything is fine, we're going okay, we have to worry about growth and this and that and the other. That's not true at all. You're about to hit, there's something in the cockpit that's screaming, pull up, pull up, pull up. You're going to hit something quite soon. So the passengers in the aircraft, and we're the crew in sense. We're saying, okay guys, cool down, it's okay, it's fine, things are fine. Keep your seat belts on, a little bit of turbulence. It's nothing like that. there is a big mountain coming out there. So the big challenge is actually institutional challenge. We have to build a completely different way of doing this. So the report lays out very clearly the four big things that we need to do. The obvious ones is we have to enable this massive energy transition, which is starting to happen. But it's very difficult because India has taken, for example, a long position in coal. So we are actually going to crash the world system because of what we've done and what we're doing. But we don't have any choice. No? We have 300 million people without bijli. Kya karenge? We have to do something about it. We have a real challenge as far as this is concerned. So even though per capita emissions are low, our emissions will grow because we have people and we have to give them, and our renewables will not catch up enough. And even if it does, our grid is problematic because the utilities are in trouble. We haven't done a power sector reform. I mean, all those things are there. But this is war in some senses. So the news on the energy front is that there are options, they are there, etc. There's a deep problem on the industrial front because we don't actually have the technologies to do this. For us, when we're doing so much of cement and steel and a whole range of other stuff that's there, the transformation of energy intensity in industry across the world is actually very slow. It's not there in the transportation sector, especially in terms of trade, in the sort of ocean transport stuff. In the air transport sector, we're really stuck because the transition to biofuels is almost kind of very difficult and impossible. So we have a big problem there. But the real story for us, as far as India is concerned in adaptation, and we have some of the best people in the room, is to deal with land and ecosystems. And here we are in very bad trouble. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where the impact is being seen. We're doing this all the time. And it's agrarian distress and structural change along with this. And it's going to become worse. There's no question about that. The interesting story, of course, like I said, is that urban areas can provide us many of the solutions we're talking about because many of the things are concentrated. But on the other hand, if you manage them the way that we're doing, there's no chance in hell we're going to make things worse. And we can see that now. We have to step out and just breathe the air in many of our cities. We know what the hell is actually happening here. But the interesting thing we're saying is, to make this happen in the next 12 years, where the turnaround will happen, we have to do all these damn things together. This is a discussion we were having, a week ago, saying when we started the process in Rio, we could do them one by one. We had the space. We've lost it 25 years. Now we have no choice. We have to do all of them together. We have to make sure that they're all simultaneously engaged. This is exactly the problem. This is, like I said, the SDG story is really not important about whether I use this index or otherwise. The question is that you've got to do pretty much all of them together, and you've got to do all the places simultaneously, and that's tough because of the institutional and other constraints. So what are the key things here? We have to basically deal with all sectors, because this story of the climate story is nothing, no different from the SDG story, whether it's changing, industrial systems or transportation systems or even agriculture. If you achieve all of those things, you've got many of your things sorted out here. It's not a big deal as far as that's concerned. So you have to deal with all sectors or most sectors, and you have to deal with all scales, and this is a really tough question. Of course, countries like ours have the opportunity of doing that because we have a lot of innovation at all these scales. So you've got to do cross-sectoral, across multiple scales, and you've got to bring all these stakeholders together. Now, that's a really tough nut to crack, because all of them are important. If you have the pilots driving the airplane and the other people not together, it just won't work, because a lot of the stuff is going to depend on citizens and individual choices and a whole range of other things that's there. So how do you actually make this happen, and where do cities come in? Obviously, this is the kind of transformations that we have. I put up the SDGs there on the top. So the critical one is energy and clean manufacturing. I'm showing you global examples because there's no single place that actually does all of this. We have to draw upon everything else in the world. We have a few examples in this country, but whatever it is. This is very critical, the ecosystem transitions. So we have to basically make the transition so that we have an inclusive built environment. We have to have green public spaces that are working. This is the kind of stuff your index, Samir has put together, that does this for urban areas in some senses. Regional food systems are very critical. This is our Achilles heel in some areas, especially as urban areas go out. The key question for us is, because of at least our demographic dividend, is we have to do this and create jobs at the same time. And that's very hard. We don't know how to do that, and most of our job creation is in the informal sector. So if you're not able to address the question of informality and sort of job creation, we're in deep trouble. There's a massive opportunity in terms of housing. Again, India is driving this like China was sometime earlier, but if we continue to do it in the way that we have, with the kind of energy intensities we're talking about, we're in very, very, very deep trouble. And like I said, this is a huge economic opportunity. It can create jobs, it can create a lot of value addition, but if you build the way that you're doing and you have buildings that last for 30 years rather than 60, straight away the dynamics change as far as that's concerned. Services are very critical to this. We have this is an example from Thailand. We're trying to do this kind of stuff in some places, but probably not to scale. You have to completely sort of rethink our transportation systems. I just put this in here because, when we took this photograph in Perth, it's a classic thing. We want to go along the route of the American, whatever it is, and the light rail or whatever it is actually the way to go. So the question then is, fair enough, we've got a real challenge here. We have a whole range of options that we can choose to, but are they feasible? Can they be done? So what we did in this report was actually a very, very systematic analysis of 28 different mitigation options based on literature across the world. Same thing for adaptation. Very detailed, what we call multidimensional analysis across 6 different dimensions, not only economics, not only looking at cost benefit, we're looking at technological, institutional, social, environmental, and geohydrological kind of feasibility. So this work has been done at the global scale, but this is not operationalizable, because you have to do this for every country, and if in fact as far as India is concerned, you'll have to do it for many different urban areas. You have to drill this down. So what we've shown here is technically it's possible to do this, but you need the innovation, you need the research, you need the evidence to do it. And once you do it, then you can start making your choices, because the question is, what mix do I take? How do I bring it into action? Do I put it into smart? Do I put it into X and Y and Z? We have to drill this down and break it down. So the first beginnings have been made for this, but the key thing that we have here is a scaffolding that helps us look at options, helps us prioritize options, look at the enabling conditions, the kind of thing that we were just asked just now, and most important, looking at the synergies and trade-offs. For example, we know that if you move towards biofuels, it's not a bad thing, and you might be able to use biofuels to fly your aircraft if you want to fly aircraft, right? Where are the biofuels going to come from? They're going to come from plantations. If those plantations are going to be placed in many parts of India, they're either going to be in dryland areas or wasteland areas, if you're lucky, and they're going to need water, which you don't have in the first place. So there's an immediate conflict between land availability, water availability, and the creation of biofuels. So if you really want to move to, flying all your aircraft with biofuels, you can technically do it. But what's going to happen to the people on those lands? Where the water going to come from? How are you going to deal with those questions? Is very, very critical. That's one example. There are many other things that have been dealt with. There's a very, very systematic kind of process to actually deal with that. So the key question here is, how do you enable this process? This is very high level, again, from the science here. The most important question for us is to strengthen multi-level governance. Lots of detail, I'm just giving you the high level questions. Why? Because the challenge is, how do you connect the local with the regional, with the national, with the global stuff? Because it's a globally connected process. The global supply chains, your petrol that's coming here may come either from the Gulf or from Mexico or maybe from US fracking, who knows at the current point of time. But you need to be able to try to balance that stuff out. This is the significant and most difficult challenge that's there. The second thing is to build convergent policies. Those of us who worked in the policy space for many years, to have convergent policies in one sector is like damn difficult. To do it across like 4 is almost impossible. So you can say, okay, let's go home, let's have a party. It doesn't work without that. The key challenge to that is a lack of institutional capacity. Similar stories to what we have in the urban space in India in some senses. We're mirroring, but in a different dimension. We're not thinking about this question. And then, of course, the big story is we have to expand and redirect the funding, because this is a significant global change. It cannot be done without that. You cannot effect this scale of change without actually reforming the global financial system. So what we're talking about just now with the UN Secretary General is saying, okay, next year UN SDG Summit, you're going to bring heads of state. Our Prime Minister is going to go there. But for God's sake, bring your Finance Minister, but most important, bring the head of your central bank, because this means redirection of trillions of dollars of investment. You have to change around the fact that in some places you're still investing in coal-fired power plants. Of course, many of the multilateral development banks are no longer doing that anymore. You've obviously got to accelerate innovation and technology. For India, for example, carbon capture and storage and clean coal technology is very important for us, at least in the medium run. But the real question at the end of it is really about how we change our behavior. Because it cannot work with 200 countries deciding, hum kal se ye kaam shuru karne wala. It will not happen. It has to be citizen-driven processes, and we do have some science in this area, but it's going to be quite difficult to do it. But let's look at the numbers we're talking about here. So basically, if you're looking at the mitigation side, we have actually no ideas on adaptation at the moment. This is one of the big gaps there is in knowledge. We're talking about something like about 800 billion a year to make this transition. Okay, so it's the Paris Climate Accord made a commitment of about 100 billion to enable this process. So this is the shock in a sense the system, saying that to do this stuff, which you need to do, otherwise you're going to have an overshoot, is going to take this amount of money. Actually, the reason I showed you those graphs in the beginning was we're going to add 30 trillion just from the urban sector or from cities in the next 20 years. So effectively at the macro level, all the equations are adding up. The question is how to redirect that to make it actually work. So we're talking about 5 to 8 times the amount that was committed in Paris, and there's going to be a big fight in Poland like in the next 2 weeks, because all the G77, including India, are going to be saying, give us a little bit more, do this or the other. But the game is much bigger than that. There's also a big knowledge gap on adaptation, which is the question of agriculture and land and all that kind of other stuff, which is very central to India. We have no idea. This is an area in which we absolutely no idea. I mean, I've worked with the top guys in the world in this process. We do not have numbers on this question, how much it will cost. There are lots of pie in the sky numbers. There's no adequate science in this. But the more important thing is, apart from this 800 billion, you basically have to redirect something of the order of, let's say, 10 trillion over the next, let's say, 12, 15 years or so, out of standard assets, whether it's coal-fired plants or cities, the way that we're doing it, into other things. Because if the markets don't signal that, it's not going to work. You're going to be pushing against the markets. And that's why it critically involves the organized private sector, the informal private sector, national governments, state governments, and other processes. And this is a hard question, which we haven't addressed, I would say, since the last World War in some senses. How do you redirect this kind of sector of finance? And the current financial system is not engaged to try and do this kind of stuff. In our country, of course, we're in a different situation at all. But this is really big stuff. It's not small stuff, because the change is very big that we're talking about. So basically, what do we learn? The first and most important thing is to get the idea that these impacts are going to be experienced in our lifetime. The choices that we make, what we do today, is going to impact us. It is certainly going to impact our children, and much worse. So basically, there are going to be at least 5 billion people who will experience this process. The question on climate is not whether climate change is happening. In cities, of course, we know temperature elevations are higher because of whatever it is. The question is how many days is it going for? In some places in the world, we're already having 200 days of overshoot. So it's going to go from 200 to 300, is it going to 300 to 365 is the question in some senses. So this is real, it's happening, and pretty much everybody is affected. Ecosystems don't talk back to us. The impacts on them are immeasurable in some senses. We can see that. I mean, you can see it most obviously in marine systems. In the work that we're doing on terrestrial systems and other things, we know what the impacts are. They're like, you can't come back from many things, and you can talk about that later. So basically, this is going to be catastrophic in some sense, and it could undo much of what we've done in the last 70 years. We think that progress is unidirectional, it's going to work, it's going to be great for us, etc., etc. But the fact is that we are hitting real ecological, biophysical limits, and eventually, the biosphere is so thin, the atmosphere is so thin. We think that we're going to live forever, and whatever we're doing is going to work forever, etc., etc. So basically, we have to really enable a very rapid and dramatic transition in all these systems, and do all this stuff together. That's the crazy thing, I mean, can we do this or not? This has only typically been done in war economies when these kind of changes have happened. So basically, city level stuff works, but cities can't do it alone. So there's the other thing saying, okay, Paris and New York and whatever it is, Delhi will get together and they'll solve the world's problem. It can't be done that way. It's actually all of us together. We have to do all of these things together on the institutional side. That's the most critical thing in some senses. So in effect, in different parts of the world, in different parts of this country, we have a lot of these solutions, but they're micro solutions, or they exist for 5 or 10 million people. Fine? The challenge is we've run out of time. Okay? We have 12 years to do this, at least work the turnover. If not, in, let's say, I said 8,000 days, we're going to start seeing the beginnings of the overshoot. So I don't want to end on a bad note, so can I have the next thing? I'll take 10 minutes and show you how, in a very small way, the world can actually work in different, so, okay. So, anyway, cool. Change that also. So this building is an interesting building, not only because you people are in it, but because we inherited this building from Microsoft. This is Microsoft Research Headquarters. It was one of the more energy intensive buildings when we took it. It's still not very good. We rent it, we don't own it. I wouldn't have built a building like this. But partially because of what they left us and what we've done, we've turned this into a laboratory in some senses. Okay? And I'm going to show you in very, very concrete terms how, in simple ways, you can actually make a difference. Can we put the website up there? So this is stuff on our website. Like I said, so basically, the sustainability stuff is great, and we've shown you this big picture stuff that's there. Actually, it's very simple. Those of us who are doing this in their everyday work, one is sitting in front of me. Yeah, you can bring that up there. Yeah. No, just I want the slide here. I want that up on that screen. Or you forget that, just put the slide up here. So you can see this is on our website just now. What we've started to do over the last 2 years or so is actually to measure what we're doing. Now in India, of course, we are used to doing jugaad and flying by our pants, which is a great thing to do, and that's how many things get done. But actually, when you start doing a little bit of science and measurement, that's there. Doesn't matter. Put the slide up. I'll show it to you. Put the slide. Slide is up there? Yeah, we have the slide. Okay, great. Put the slide up. On that side, please also. That's with me, is it? Okay. So anyway, this is our website. You can see it. The URL is there, etc., etc. This is a fancy thing we're doing here. So we're doing various things that are there, and I'll show you how it works. We're tracking in this building a whole range of things. So the most obvious thing is, we do real-time monitoring. We've got a weather station on the top. This is real-time stuff for last month of how temperature is moving, etc. So we're streaming and monitoring weather data. Why is that important? Because there's a network now that started in Bangalore where the number of locations in the city that are streaming weather data. Why is that important for us from the climate point of view? Because on an average, we're doing 1.5 to 3 degrees urban heat island elevation in the city. And if we don't actually know what the hell is happening, we can't contain it. So this question of cutting trees or not cutting trees or building differently, etc., we can't operationalize this question. So one of the simple and easy things to do, it doesn't cost very much for institutions to do, is to spend 1.5 lakhs on weather station. It sets up stuff, and if we have enough weather stations in the city, at the moment, I don't know, we've got about 20, 30 or at the moment, if we have like 200 of them and mapped it across the city, we actually know what's happening. You don't have to depend on, IMD and a whole range of other sources. We are very important. There are base stations to actually do this. So we measure this stuff, and you can see what's happening in the city. What's happening in the thing, so that, for example, it's rainfall over last month. We're seeing a little bit of rain here and there. That's temperature. It's a controlled building, so you won't see it. That's the indoor air quality. We measure this. And so you can see here, I mean, if you look at the air quality index that's there, so typically air quality index under 100 is good. Some days it goes up about 200, 220, that's there. We actually measure this stuff so you know what's happening. And one of the things that Pooja is trying to do just now is to build for ourselves as we go onto our own campus a dashboard where you are actually able to track this in real time. We have real time data that's there. I'm just showing you the aggregated work. So essentially, we know that there are episodes of unhealthy air. For example, if you were to measure air quality at the moment, because there's so many of us here and various other things, there would actually be a decline because of that. So then what do? Do you bring in fresh air? How do you deal with it becomes a critical question. This is the thing that, everybody, I showed you the thing of SO2. This is actual PM10 and PM 2.5 measurements that are here. Typically our air quality here is not bad, so for PM 2.5 at about 100 ppm, that's about 25 micrograms per meter cube, and about 200 ppm or so, which is above this for 2.5. So interesting things. This really this surprised us. But when you go in and look at the data, you can do it on the website. You find this is happening between 8 and 9 in the morning. What is that? The place being cleaned. So again, not a big deal, but the fact is once you start measuring these things, oh, it's obvious, So then you can start saying, okay, we can deal with this and deal with whatever it is as far as that's concerned. So that's, similarly here, this is the difference between indoor and outdoor air quality. So the blue there is the outdoor air quality, the red line is the indoor air quality. Big debate here when we enter this building. Should we, Bangalore, why should we have an air conditioned building? It's not a good idea, etc., etc. So it's not a great idea. We've done a lot of stuff on the energy efficiency side. However, there are two things that we discovered to our surprise that make a difference. When we're teaching, because we have double glazed windows, it really cuts down the noise. And the second thing is that there are real improvements in air quality. That's not a reason to do air conditioning. It's a very bad idea because it increases your energy intensity by about 4 times. But when you measure it, you can see exactly what's happening here. So the question for us as we are designing our campus for our designers is, how can you get the same kind of outcomes for something that's not necessarily climate controlled? We have a whole team that's kind of working and struggling with this, some of the best people in the country. So again, not very difficult to put up. You can put up monitors, you can do this in every room, you can see what's happening. On the energy side, this is stuff we've been measuring for a long period of time. This is the annual daily variations. These are, these drops are because of weekends and stuff like that. We know what the loads are every 5-10 minutes. I mean, we talk about smartness. This building is tending to become let's say a smart building as far as it's concerned. There's a major energy conservation process that we brought down. Our EPI now is at about 5.26, which is well below the current standards that are there. We're trying to push it even further, because unless you push it further down to something like whatever under 3 or 4, we're never going to get to the climate story that we're talking about. It doesn't work. We know exactly how the breakdown is. So obviously air conditioning is one big part of that. The plug loads are a big one. So computers we discovered, again this is pretty obvious, Amy Robinson's been talking about this for 30 years, are a big guzzler of energy. And especially if you don't switch them off at night, then it keeps drawing energy through the night, so you have a base load that's there. So when you start measuring these things, you are able to sort of understand what's happening. Lighting, we made major changes because we've done a massive LED retrofit in this building. And of course, building services like lifts, you can't do much about, but we can do things about them. But once you start measuring them, and you can see here, we know exactly what's happening is, and we don't only measure them at the level of what the end users, we're doing it floor by floor. So we say, hey, the third floor guys are doing some crazy stuff there. Say, what's happening? They're having a party, they're doing whatever it is, or the air quality is better. We can actually track this stuff and see what's happening, because the cutting edge of this is actually in the behavior change. So for God's sake, don't set your thermostat at below 26 degrees. Can I keep my set temperature at 28? How does that work with my carbon dioxide? Those are things that actually make a difference as far as that's concerned. So it involves very clear targeting and also feedback. People need to know. I mean, everybody wants to do this stuff, but can they actually do it? Do they know what's actually happening as far as that's concerned? So we have breakdowns of this, as you can see over the last year to this year. Air conditioning loads are down. Lighting loads are more or less similar because already happened. Building services are better. But our plug-in loads have grown up because we've added like 25 new people. So this is a classic problem of managing a facility. When you go out and do stuff, how do you balance these things out? Similarly, on carbon emissions, we actually measure this stuff. We're at about 10 tons at the moment. So most of it is actually in transport. This is the thing that really struck us. Most of our emissions here are local transportation. So we're saying, okay, now it's not only about the building. We have to think about other stuff. Our footprints are quite important. We track water also in the similar way. This building has ultrasonic meters that are tracking every single major water line in the building. So last month, for example, we consumed about 160 odd kiloliters, which is about 40 liters per capita for those of us in the water business. not so bad, but we can do a lot better. But we know exactly now where the water is going. The bulk of the water is actually going for our plants. Okay, so that's the other question. The plants are helping deal with stuff on the air quality side and other stuff. So how can we go to a more xerophytic kind of environment as far as it's concerned? The other thing that's surprising here is our wash is quite large. So Pooja is working on this. We've just fitted a whole range of aerators here because we tend to wash our own plates, as you will see. And maybe it's more efficient on the water side to go to having a mechanical system to do it rather than people. But then there are lots of trade-offs there when you start thinking about these questions. We use much less in the washrooms than we thought we would, and of course drinking is much less. There again, we can do it by flow-wise. We know who's consuming what, whatever it is. On the solid waste side, we track solid waste consumption, so about 130 kilos of wet waste, which is all composted. It goes back into our food systems that are there. Again, it's a little bit of a surprise. There is recyclable dry waste, but there's also non-recyclable stuff. When you start measuring this, you find it. What happens to your broken glass? Nobody's going to take that. We're actually measuring this in a systematic way, so we know pretty much exactly what's happened. This is a month-by-month thing that's there. We have a team that's working with us. We have a great NGO partner in this process that's there. And then finally, this is a productive environment. This building is interesting. It doesn't look very cool, but if you go up on the roof, you'll see we have a garden there. And we're trying to do lots of stuff on that. This is a small patch that's there. Obviously, on the campus, we're doing a hell of a lot more. There's a massive ecological design process that's there. We get about 20 odd kilos a month. So, in effect, for every working day, we're getting a one kilo of harvest because we're recycling the stuff back into that system. And you can see what we have. It will obviously change from season to season because it's seasonal as far as that's concerned. And we have, quite a lot of biodiversity inside the building, even though it's a building that's there. So we track this and see what's happening. Obviously, if you see the large elements in the pie, there are some particular species that are more than otherwise. So the reason that I showed you this is, basically, the sustainability stuff is a very tangible area. We've shown you big picture, all kinds of stuff that's there. But actually, each of us, one of us, if we take a little bit of time and effort and put a little bit of thinking and resources into it, we can do it. It's not so complicated. It doesn't take a lot of stuff to do. But the key thing in this that we've learned is, if you don't measure the stuff, you don't know where the hell you're going. Okay? I mean, Jugaad is great, but if you don't measure it, you can't track where you want to go, and you need science and innovation, deployment of technology to make it happen. It doesn't work without that. But when you do that, it's not that expensive. Obviously, this is the first time, it's a single facility, but it's not so expensive to take this out and do stuff, whether it's on the monitoring side or actually, people have been doing terrace gardens and other gardens in the city forever. But it requires perseverance. It's taken us at least 2 or 3 years to get to the situation where people came here maybe 4 or 5 years ago and said, what the hell are you doing here? This is crazy, you should do something better. And you can make this progress, and this is true for everybody. It's not rocket science in some senses. So in some senses, I would try and make the argument that at least for those of us who are in public institutions and educational institutions, we can start with this stuff now. It's very inexpensive. We know how much it costs. Hopefully in a few months' time, we will give you the economics of this process also. We're still trying to figure that out. But I mean, by and large, I would say it's working. We're doing this at a much more significant scale with our campus. So in the campus, we'll have 20 buildings like this, and they'll all be streaming this data to the internet. We already have one PhD that's working on this data. Hopefully, there'll be many more master studies that are there, because people have to learn how to do this stuff. Because if 10,000 people do this, they'll do it 50 times better than we have. And it's not so difficult to do. It's not complicated. So all that great stuff that we saw was great and interesting, but we have to start in very concrete, simple ways. And if you do that in an educational institution or a public institution, people can actually take that home, show it to other people, and it can actually work. It's not so difficult, it's simple. And we're happy to show you how this works. We're struggling on many things, including our carbon dioxide emissions inside the building at the moment. So it's not as if it's simple, but it can be done. So, I gave you a really bad story of how difficult life is, but on the other hand, doing very simple, practical things is possible. And if we add all of that up, that's the only way we can get there. We can't get there by making great speeches and spending lots of money and stuff like that. We have to do it step by step by step, and do it one at a time. So yeah, thanks. And somebody's been showing me all kinds of things in the back. Kavita, what do you want to do? Yeah, no, I'm done. I just didn't want to end on a really, really depressing note of the world is about to end and we can't do anything about it.
Thank you so much.
You want to break for tea, take responses, or whatever? What's your deal? You want questions? Questions after tea or in tea? During tea. Huh? Tum batao, you're in charge. Okay, great.
Just to kind of I think the challenge is not just in measuring it,
Yeah.
but in aligning collective action.
Yes.
Given that I mean, we are living in political democracies by and large. So, but for odd instances of China and some other blips in the liberal democracy radar right now, as we see today. So something like this is actually the governments in all over the world can actually rub their hands in glee and say, yes, here is one way of enforcing kind of technocratic action, top down. The challenge, I think, is moving from this to a kind of a more collective action framework, especially along three. Our challenges are actually threefold. One, that our political incentives are completely misaligned to this. So political parties don't think like this, nor are there horizons in this frame. At best, they think 5 years, at best. At worst, we know what they think. Uh, Second, our financial incentives are again completely misaligned on this. And third, our cultural incentives, which perhaps are the most interesting things of looking over each other's shoulders and figuring out right, quote unquote, right ways of doing things. We've already transitioned from a scarce subsistence, let's conserve cultural lifestyle to more aspirational, what is considered more aspirational ways of living, which are completely on the other side of the spectrum. So just a little reflection. I don't think this is something that can be answered in 2 minutes, but it will be useful if the next couple of days and the following sessions also dwell a little more on the fact that you have laid out this complete doomsday and high-level doomsday scenario, and that you've also laid out in some minor way of how even something like as unsustainable a building as this is, we can make a difference. The problem is that here, if you look at this building itself, at the top, you could say there is alignment in terms of understanding the issue, doing something about it. And there is a cultural orientation to among people who are our colleagues who say, yes, let's do something, whatever little we can. I don't think you will see the same thing in most other kind of, this is a very controlled environment where you can work it out. Most environments are not controlled environments where the random questions of, frankly, of conflict politics, negotiation, dealing with stuff, trade-offs, zero-sum games are kind of rife. And I think policymakers or policy technocrats, we work in the day-to-day in some ways while keeping the long run in mind because we are looking for kind of what is to be done. And some of it doesn't kind of translate into any form of action.
Cool. Okay. Good provocation for the next day and a half. Thank you so much. Sorry for taking the time. But yeah. So, break for tea.
How's Kavali doing in New York?
She's doing fine. Sorry, I extended your. Okay, so yeah, if people just settle in, I mean, questions and all can maybe come in a little while. I just mentioned very briefly that the report that I showed you with those large tables is available. So we've asked Dr. Ravindra, who's in a sense the doyen of everything urban in the city, maybe in the state, for many, many years. And he's been very kind to come and join us to do this. So I'm going to ask him to release the book or the documents available for everybody here. So Dr. Ravindra, if you could please.
First of all, let me congratulate IIHS and Dr. Ramar for the excellent work, the presentation, especially this document, I think, giving details about each state. It's certainly a very, very useful thing. We always keep talking about lack of data at the city level. I think here is an attempt to compile such data, which will, I think, go a long way in trying to understand the urban systems. But I mean, it's really a frightful picture, climate change that has been presented, because I don't know how much we can actually translate these into practice. It needs a lot of motivation in the first place. I think one of the slides said, borrowing from the previous American President Barack Obama, yes, we can. But I think we should also consider what his successor, Trump, has been saying. He says, yes, we can't. He doesn't just believe in climate change. And so I don't know how we are going to motivate him, your entire IPCC team, because unless the leader of the democratic world is convinced about its implementation, it's going to be a very, very tough task at the global level. But at the same time, I think we should take inspiration from what IIHS has done in trying to implement things in a small way. I mean, their own building, for instance, and the local community we can think of. So at city level, I think this is what I have also been trying to emphasize, that I think we need action at the city level. I mean, naturally, the world is becoming more urban and all that. So if we are able to think of some systems and practices at the city level, I think that will go a long way, which means a lot of collective action, or rather, I would say to begin with, collaborations between institutions. See, Bangalore itself has so many good institutions, apart from IIHS. We have the Indian Institute of Science, Institutes of Management, law schools, and even other, ITRI, and many other smaller organizations, which are doing actually field work. These big institutions may be doing a lot of academic work and bringing in data and best practices and all that, but there are a number of organizations in Bangalore, including resident associations, which may be doing small things in solid waste management, lake protection, and preventing tree felling, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of such things. So let us all take inspiration from this, and let me once again say, well done, congratulations, and we look forward to more and more of such documents in future. Thank you.
Fine, sir. Thank you. Just a quick comment on what you were saying. I think the pushback to President Trump in the US at least, because you've seen it quite closely, has actually come from cities. So there was a big convening in September in California, where I think there were about a dozen states and 200 cities that made commitments that were ahead of the Paris Climate Accord. So the pushback in California, as you well know, is
yeah, California
is
is
such a large economy.
In a way.
Exactly.
Yeah, California is an example. As a state also, it has gone against Trump.
Macro level, like power plants, oil is fine, but even the cities can do it.
Exactly. So the governor of California, Jerry Brown, who is a sort of extended friend, he basically, in that meeting, because Trump had announced that they will stop measuring methane emissions in the US and NASA would stop tracking them, California announced that we're going to put our own satellite into orbit.
Yeah, exactly.
And they can do it because they have for Musk, or otherwise they can do it both politically and otherwise. So I think what's happening just now is the mobilization is happening in response.
I think that's what in a way needs to happen in India, which means in more autonomy to states.
Exactly.
And coming back to political transformation or political reforms, unless the states have a much bigger say in what they want to do, and funding, as I said, ultimately the states also need more finances and funding, and then the decentralization to the local level, the cities, the towns, and even in the rural areas. And as I said, just one last comment, speaking about decentralization. See, in Karnataka, it's a very interesting example in the sense, in rural decentralization, we have done very well. Karnataka was one of the first states to introduce Panchayati Raj in a true sense of the term, even before the 73rd Amendment to the Constitution. In the mid-80s, when Ramakrishna Hegde was the Chief Minister, they brought a new Panchayati Raj Act, which was perhaps a little more radical than what was even envisaged in the 73rd Amendment. But on urban, it is the opposite. There's hardly any urban decentralization. The states are still powerful, they dictate. The local bodies have to depend on the state governments. So this conflict we see, and addressing, as I said, urban decentralization is going to be a very, very serious question. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, you're the architect of an almost radical revolution in
Bangalore,
metropolitan governance.
Metropolitan
It's been probably the first metropolitan area in the country that would have had that. The act actually didn't clear. We're hoping that the next generation, we can't give up on these things.
The bill is on the table for a metropolitan, Bangalore Metropolitan Governance Act. Let's hope, as I said,
we get some moment.
Some moment it will happen.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I guess people have given up on what I had to say. So.
No, but if